Hi, everybody. I wanted to continue our conversation about Yates by addressing the poems that I've assigned from the latter part of his career. These are magnificent poems that stand monumentally in world poetry. For us, I've assigned Sailing to Byzantium, Leda and the Swan, and Under Ben Bulben for closure. I'd be talking to you for a very long time if I were to attempt anything like a comprehensive reading of these poems, even one of these poems. So my aim right now is to give you footholds in them. And again, if you've studied them before, that's fabulous. If you have not had the chance to study them before, I'm so happy that I get to share them with you. Okay, so let's start with Sailing to Byzantium. This is as complex and puzzling a poem as we've had yet. It is, again, looking at these sort of contradictions that Yates was so interested in and their irreconcilability: mortality, immortality, youth, maturity, old age, and regenerative sexuality. And these are the themes that pervade this poem. And as always, when Yates is speaking to us, he's also speaking most broadly about the creative state, about art, and about what the sort of patterns of reality are that shape and change everything. So he begins, "That is no country for old men." And what he's referring back to is this notion, this sort of imaginative construct of Byzantium, not a literalized one. And if he's thinking of anything, maybe he's thinking of the beautiful churches in Italy that we know he saw that had the Byzantine mosaic tradition brought to them. So places like the Basilica of San Marco, or maybe he's thinking of Eastern edifices that have in little gold mosaic tiles the rendering of saints. This is what he's talking about at a literal imagistic level, but it's going to go from there. And it goes to the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees. So there we go, we're never far. And then the whole panoply of life: salmon, mackerel, fish, flesh, fowl, whatever it is, everything is there. And in the mind of this speaker, somehow neglecting monuments of unaging intellect. And one of the things that this speaker is going to try to do is sort of say, I can somehow surmount the passing of time through an intellectual endeavor or effort. I can lift out of those dying generations. Stanza 2, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick. And stick, coat, these are the pervasive images of Yates's later poetry. And they're grappling with these questions of, can we get out of this bind of mortality? We're given youth. The bargain is that we must age. And he goes on and says, so soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Singing, along with dancing, has become one of those sort of default images or activities that the poetry cites. And so he goes on to say, but that doesn't happen unless they're studying monuments of its own magnificence. So again, our speaker here wants to take us back to this notion that somehow we can enter into the sort of glories of art, or the glories of Byzantine art, the glories of reproduction from an intellectual perspective, which is a very difficult proposition when you think about it. Stanza 3, he makes a kind of proffer to God. O stages standing in God's holy fire. And that would be those Byzantine mosaic images where in these ancient churches candles are lit, and of course the gold mosaic and the candlelight interplay very beautifully. And that's quite literally what he means about that gold mosaic on the wall. Come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, there we go again, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away. Sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, it knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Okay, fascinating moment. Our speaker has come to this kind of impasse, if you will. The young in one another's arms, those dying generations. You can't easily resolve that tension. In fact, you can't. And remember, Yates is interested in agon, in the sort of difficulties of contraries that play out. And so, how can you surmount mortality? Can you do it through art? That's one of the effective questions that the poem is asking. And so, by stanza 4, he hypothesizes, what would that be if I could be lifted instead of being this dying animal? And we're all dying animals, some of us sooner than others. If we could be lifted out of that, what would this look like to be in that artifice? Artifice not being the same thing as art, that artifice of eternity. So once out of nature, I shall never take my body from any mortal thing, which is rather an extraordinary wish when you think about it. But that's what this speaker is wishing. But such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling. In other words, I will transform almost alchemically. I will leave this mortal coil. I will slough it off. I will become that artifice. This is how I'm going to get out of the bind of being mortal. This is how I'm going to break that bargain that we all have of being at one point young in one another's arms, and then at another point in our lives, not as much. And so I'm going to have myself made into a thing that's artificial, into artifice, not art, but some kind of reproduction, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing, birds again, to lords and ladies of Byzantium, of what is past, or passing, or to come. So in other words, I will surmount time. If I can escape the bonds of flesh, I effectively surmount death and time. But what I give up is I give up all of what good is at the beginning of this poem. Those salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, whatever is begotten, born, and dies in that sensual music. It's a magnificent poem, grappling with the later stages of life, grappling with, does art save you? Does a career as an artist give you a privileged position? Are you lifted out? And is there anything ultimately that preserves us from the circling backs of time and history, even at the level of our physical being? And the answer is probably not. Because the answer logically is, you would rather be in that bond of time than be that mechanical, repetitive, and ultimately artificial construct, which is the only way out of it, is to be not alive, to become an object or become a thing. We can explore this further together. Let's look at Leda and the Swan. 121. Leda and the Swan is, in many regards, a sort of endpoint. of these reflections about time in history and the intervention of various historical narratives from the Christian to the earlier Greek upon which this is based, to all of the confluences of time in history. When we get together and look at the Second Coming, we're going to talk about what the concept is of divinity, or of some kind of ruling God. Here in this poem, what I want you to bear in mind is that it is a brutal literalization of this image of interpenetrativeness, which is not only this flow of time and its repetitive and circular nature, but it's quite frankly interpenetrative and sexual nature. There is in that image, baked into it, an image of sexual intercourse as well. And so what we find here in Leda and the Swan is a literalizing of what happens to humans when the gods suddenly invade our time or our space. The metaphor he uses is Zeus's rape of Leda. And the questions that he asks are rhetorical questions, and they are questions designed to take us into the heart of the nature of power, violence, eruptions of violence in the cycles of human history that, from Yates's perspective, inevitably repeat and inevitably don't go well for the human. This is actually a sonnet, and it doesn't always look that way at first glance, but when we break it down, we see that we have what resembles not a Shakespearean, but a Petrarchan sonnet. So we had 2 quatrains which compose the octet, and we have 2 sestets which compose 2 tercets which compose the sestet. So the Shakespearean sonnet is 14 lines of 4, 4, 4, and then 2. This is taken from the slightly older Italian model. I'm not going to read it all the way through because we can do that together in class. A sudden blow, and then the use of the colon, the full stop. Absolutely dramatic, incredibly difficult to do in the context of poetry. The great wings beating still, again, a bird. These images that have begun at the Lake Isle of Innisfree with those linnets have culminated after decades into this mature work. That word still, we talked a lot about it with respect to the wild swans at Cool. So the great wings beating still above the staggering girl. And in this context, with the way the line enjambs onto the second line, we are forced to hear all the different uses of the word still. Her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. An act of violence has occurred. We see the bird only in composite parts, birds, nape, webs. Second stanza, a series of questions begins with its empathetic structure around Leda. How can those terrified vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid, not even the person, the disassociative reaction that is potentially part of this experience, the terror of it, the inhumanness of it, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies. The bird is not only not human, the bird is not even of the order of ordinary creation. The bird is the guise of Zeus come down to earth to visit himself upon the girl. We get the shift. Just as with Shakespearean, as well as with Petrarchan sonnets, there's a shift where different statements get made. In the Petrarchan format, which we're in, that happens after the first 8 lines. A shudder in the loin engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. And then the very dramatic dropping of the line, where Yates is boldly experimenting with what can be done with one of the older poetic forms and completely innovating. Being, which is both a noun and a gerund here. Being so caught up, here's your final question, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? With, of course, the attendant question being, and so, even if she did, so what? It's an extraordinarily powerful poem. It's a poem that assesses the role of humanity against the vicious and violent cycles of the historical framework of reality as its victim. We're not in control. This is what we found in Second Coming as well. We have narratives, we have stories, we have words, we have master narratives that attempt to frame these things for us. But ultimately and finally, we're not in control. And that's what this poem is about. It is a massive grappling with the realization of the essential sort of awful power of the tides of history against a single person, or maybe against all of us. We round off our reading of these later poems with a nod toward Ben Bulben. This was a difficult call for me. I could have kept adding poem after poem. In many ways, I wish I'd assigned Crazy Jane Talks to the Bishop, and maybe we'll weave it in if we have time in class. Again, it's from this later pool of poetry where in something like Sailing to Byzantium, Yates is grappling with the end of sex and love, and how do you resist death, and how do you escape the bargain we've all got? We get to be alive, that means we have to die. This sort of collision of forces. Or Leda in the Swan, we get to occupy the earth. This means that we are the victims of time and history. And its repetitions will incessantly visit themselves on us. In Under Ben Bulben, we have a kind of attempt to swing, to order all of these ideas. This is one of the poems at the very end of his life's work. And he is, again, contemplating the antitheses of things, the sort of designs that seem to govern it all. And there's even a little tiny return here to, a nod to the earlier days, to the Irish lore that occupied his earlier poetry. There's a kind of sense of, question of, does art save us? Does being that art person who's worked and worked as an artist, is that in its when you reach a cumulative point in your life, is that meaningful? What lessons come to us from that? And he seems to say quite a few, including Irish poets, learn your trade, sing whatever is well made. That well-made craft, that well-made poem, those well-made words are constitutive of reality. They govern it. So inasmuch as Second Coming or Leda are dark, dark visions of the nature of things, remember Yates is always interested in that equal and opposite pull, the pull to the creative, in spite of the mortal that must go with it. At the very end of the poem, we have his presaging of his own resting spot in Drumcliff Churchyard, where he will be laid. And he closes it with 3 lines that in fact were inscribed on his headstone. Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by. Amazing lines with which to end our class. So we're going to stop with that. We're at our tape. And I look forward to talking about all of this with you.